Over the past 20 years or so, the Indonesian economy has really done quite brilliantly. Indonesia has consistently posted remarkably strong growth figures and has quietly become, if you adjust for purchasing power, the 7th largest economy in the world, according to the latest IMF data. At the same time, the country has developed a hard-won reputation for fiscal prudence. Indonesia has consistently run manageably small budget deficits, and its debt-to-GDP ratio has generally stayed below 40%. However, in the past year or so, the vibes have suddenly shifted, prompting a sell-off in both Indonesia's bonds and currency and provoking some increasingly unorthodox policy reactions from the government. So in this video, we thought we'd explain why the Indonesian economy is looking a bit shaky and why things look like they might get
Every
worse
house you buy
before they
comes with
get
a
better.
garage. Where else would you display your favorite cars? The best thing is, you can decorate each garage exactly how you want.
Anxieties about
Cluttered,
material
minimalist,
self-sufficiency,
the list goes
a
on.
turn towards protectionism, great powers
let's see what
asserting
you
their
can do with
spheres of
space.
influence, this
Let
all
your
looks suspiciously
imagination
similar
run
to the
wild.
build-up to the First World
It'll
War.
cost credits
In the
to put
latest
items
issue of our
down,
magazine,
but
we
get it
explore
back
the
if you change
remarkable
your mind.
parallels between now and
No
then,
drama.
and ask whether we can avoid a third one. That's just one of 80 pages in the magazine though, because as always there's more to too long than you'd expect. Purchase your copy by clicking the link in the description. So, as we see it, arguably the root cause of Indonesia's recent economic shakiness are the government's big spending plans. For context, since coming to power in late 2024, Indonesia's president, Prabowo Subianto, has announced a number of costly policies, including an ambitious housing plan, a program for 80,000 village cooperatives, and his flagship Free Nutritious Meals program, which aims to provide free and nutritious lunches to more than 80 million people, mostly school-aged children and pregnant women. These sweeping programs were already taking their toll on the state finances. The Free Nutritious Meals program alone accounts for something like 10% of all Indonesian government expenditures, but they've since come under even more strain since the war in Iran and the subsequent increase in global energy prices. This is both because Indonesia imports most of its oil, which means the recent increase in oil prices has put a dampener on the economy and decreased tax revenues, but also because the Indonesian government subsidizes fuel. So, as global oil prices have surged, the cost of these subsidies has ballooned. Now, to be clear, we're not saying that governments shouldn't spend money, or that these are bad policies per se. However, the problem in Indonesia's case specifically is how these big spending plans interact with so-called state finance law, which limits budget deficits to 3% of GDP. For context, the state finance law was passed in the wake of the 1998 financial crisis, which hit Indonesia incredibly hard. Indonesia's currency, the rupiah, lost 80% of its value against the US dollar. Inflation surged over 60%, and GDP contracted by roughly 13% in 1998 alone, the steepest decline among the crisis-affected nations. The economic devastation triggered widespread social unrest, which contributed quite directly to the fall of President Suharto in May 1998, ending a 31-year period of authoritarian rule. After elections in 1999, Indonesia's first post-Suharto parliament passed the state finance law in 2003. The law basically copied and pasted the EU's so-called Maastricht criteria for aspiring Eurozone members, limiting budget deficits to 3% of GDP and the overall debt-to-GDP ratio to 60%, and was framed as a guarantee against a repeat of the 1998 crisis. It's proved remarkably durable. With the exception of the worst pandemic years, every Indonesian government since has stuck to it, and Indonesia has earned a reputation for fiscal competence with the international markets. Now, Prabowo's big-ticket programs were already testing these limits, with the deficit coming in at 2.9% of GDP last year. But when the war in Iran kicked off and energy prices started surging, it quickly became clear that, if he wanted to keep the deficit below 3%, Prabowo would have to either wind down one of his big policies or scrap the fuel subsidy, with the finance ministry forecasting a 3.6% deficit if fuel prices stayed around $90 a barrel. But Prabowo has refused to do either of these things and has instead resorted to a series of financial tricks to keep himself in the green. Perhaps most notably, it looks like he's pressured the Indonesian central bank into lending a hand via a so-called burden-sharing agreement, agreed last year. The specifics are complicated, but the basic idea is that the central bank is printing money to buy up government debt, and also giving some of the interest it earns on that debt back to the government. This looks like a rather blatant violation of the central bank's nominal independence, which has been under threat since Prabowo installed his nephew as deputy governor last year. To ease the burden further, Prabowo has also strong-armed Indonesia's oligarchs into buying billions of dollars worth of so-called patriot bonds. There has also been some suggestion that the government is fiddling with the GDP numbers, because a bigger GDP number would allow the government to run a bigger deficit. This might sound conspiratorial, but Indonesia's GDP numbers have been coming in suspiciously consistent at basically 5% every quarter for the past few years, despite the fact that Indonesia is a big commodity exporter and should thus be affected by swings in global commodity prices. More recently, the government has claimed that growth is accelerating, coming in at a 3-year high of 5.6% in the first quarter of this year. But this looks somewhat implausible. Not only was this headline number well above forecast, which has started happening suspiciously often with Indonesia's GDP prints, but when you dig into the data, there were some weird numbers. For instance, the government claimed an implausible 25-fold jump in the value of inventories, and a fair bit of the headline growth was apparently driven by growth in manufacturing, even though electricity use, which usually tracks manufacturing output, fell at the same time. Nor is this the first time that economists have cast doubt on Indonesia's official data. Last August, after quarterly data showed the country growing at its fastest rate in 2 years, local economists held a private meeting with the finance ministry asking for clarifications about the data, and especially the implausibly high investment numbers. Anyway, this has all provoked some anxiety in the markets, leading to a sell-off in Indonesia's government bonds and its currency, with the rupiah reaching a post-crisis high of nearly 18,000 to the US dollar. Prabowo has tried to stem this decline in the rupiah by imposing some remarkably draconian capital controls. In other words, by making it harder for people to get their money out of the country. In January, the government imposed new laws, basically requiring big commodity exporters to keep their foreign currency earnings locked up in the state-controlled banks for at least a year, with strict conditions and limits on withdrawals. Then last month, Prabowo took things a step further when, in a much-anticipated speech on fiscal policy, where most people expected him to try to calm the markets, he instead announced the creation of Danantara Sumber Daya Indonesia, or DSI, a new state-owned agency within Indonesia's sovereign wealth fund. DSI will apparently take near-total control over Indonesia's commodity exports. Exporters will first have to sell their commodities to DSI, which will then sell them onto the global market. The DSI will initially cover coal, palm oil and certain nickel products, for all of which Indonesia is the world's largest exporter, but could yet be expanded into other sectors too. Prabowo has framed this as an anti-tax avoidance initiative, accusing exporters of selling their commodities to offshore subsidiaries at below market prices, but it looks like a sneaky way for the Indonesian state to get its hands on even more foreign currency to defend the rupiah. Unsurprisingly, none of this has calmed the markets, and the sell-off in the rupiah has actually accelerated. The risk here is that, surrounded by yes-men, Prabowo gets stuck in a sort of doom loop, with economic turmoil inviting draconian policy interventions, leading to more economic turmoil, etc. The latest issue of our magazine, Too Long, is out now, and if you want our best value ever, subscribing and using the code SUMMER26 gets you your first copy for as cheap as £4.99, as well as 20% off as long as you stay subscribed. I actually told you about one of the articles in this edition of the magazine at the start of this video, but this issue's also jam-packed with other content from all around the world. Obviously, the headline section is our rundown of Trump's wars around the world, discussing all of the different countries and regions which have faced Trump's military wrath, going nation by nation through the timeline, and reaching the ultimate question, has Trump launched a modern holy war? From there, we dive into our regional sections, starting with the UK, where we unpack the results of the recent May elections, take a look at the UK's odd foreign posture, and discuss whether Britain has become ungovernable. Then in the EU section, we discuss how Russia's sphere of influence is fading, why Europe's energy transition isn't what you expect, and also look at the Euro's missing members. Finally, in the global section, we discuss if we're seeing echoes of the First World War, what's next for Iran, as well as what really came from the Gen Z protests we saw emerging last year. But that's not even everything. With this 80-page issue, our joint longest ever, there's even more to read than I've even been able to mention here. So click the link in the description to learn more and grab your copy of Too Long today.
Jadi selama bond market terkendali, kemampuan investor.
Over the past 20 years or so,
Hey there, I'm Scott McLean. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your look at the world of business and economics. Asian currencies under pressure. Central banks are spending billions to prevent their decline. But how long can they keep fighting the market? And is this a temporary shock or something more serious? From India to Indonesia, people across Asia are paying the price through higher food bills, costlier fuel, and shrinking purchasing power. So what are governments doing to shield them, and can they turn the tide? The battle over the Strait of Hormuz is hitting Asia where it hurts. It's currencies and people's buying power. Investors are fleeing to the safety of the U.S. dollar or gold as uncertainty over the Iran conflict drags on. And across Asia, currencies are starting to buckle under the strain. The Indian rupee, Philippine peso have fallen to record lows. Indonesia's rupiah is now weaker than it was at the depths of the Asian financial crisis. From Japan to South Korea, central banks have burned billions of dollars trying to slow the tide. For economies that rely heavily on imported energy, a weaker currency means higher costs, from food to fuel. And as households begin to feel the squeeze, governments are scrambling to shield consumers while defending their currencies. Vinton Monahan reports.
The crisis at the Strait of Hormuz has sent shockwaves through the global economy. Disruption to 20% of the world's oil and gas flows has pushed up prices and constrained supply. Many Asian countries in particular have grappled with fuel shortages and surging inflation. But now a new crisis looms that could make things even worse. Many currencies are under pressure. Oil and gas are usually bought and sold in US dollars. Countries that rely heavily on imports are now paying more, hence putting a strain on currency reserves. At the same time, investors are pulling money out of emerging markets. Uncertainty about the global economy has made gold and US Treasury bonds appear to be a safer option. In February, it took around 90 Indian rupees to get $1 US. Now, just a few months later, it takes around 95. It's a pattern being repeated in the Philippines, Indonesia, and many other countries. People are paying the price. When currencies lose value, it pushes up the cost of imported goods, including food and fuel. These food vendors in Jakarta sell tempeh, a traditional Indonesian soy dish. But they say their overheads are going up, and their customers aren't able to pay more.
The price of soybeans used to be much cheaper, around $25 for 100 kilos, but now it has reached as high as $60. As for plastic packaging, it used to cost $1.50 per kilo, and now it has increased to $2.50. We've had to reduce the size of our servings. If we raised prices, people would stop buying it.
And those who rely on foreign currency as part of their businesses are quickly finding it's much harder to come by.
My business is finished. Foreign currency is the product that we are selling. We buy it and then we sell it, and the margin that we make is our profit. When we are not able to get the product that we sell, then how do we do business?
The Indian government has tried to reduce the amount of money flowing out of the country by increasing duties on imports of precious metals. But that's having an impact on the livelihoods of people in the jewelry sector.
If people do not buy jewellery for 1 year, then what happens to the jewellers or their staff, the people involved in logistics and the craftsmen associated with this industry? I do not think that Modi thought about their livelihood at all.
Central banks are doing what they can. Japan, South Korea and several others have intervened, buying up large amounts of their own currency in a bid to stabilize its value. But doing this requires spending their reserves of US dollars, which could eventually run out. People across Asia are suffering as prices rise and their economies struggle. And the cause is in large part due to a crisis that's far away and beyond their control. Vinton Monahan, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
All right, let's discuss this further with our guest. We're joined by Alicia Garcia-Ferrero. She's the chief economist for Asia Pacific and the Middle East at Natixis. She's in Taipei. In New Delhi, Biswajit Dar is an Indian economist and a retired professor from the Jawaharlal Nehru University. And in Jakarta, we're joined by Bima Yudhistira, the executive director of the Center of Economic and Law Studies, an Indonesia-based economic think tank. Thank you all so much for being here. Alicia, we will start with you. Look, let me just set the scene here. You have the Philippine peso, you have the Indian rupee, all hitting record lows against the US dollar. Even when you look at two of the world's most advanced economy, Japan and South Korea, they are also seeing their currencies decline in value in relation to the dollar, despite government efforts to prop up those currencies. So has this reached crisis levels for Asian economies?
I would say not yet, and that's the good news. But it could, and that's the bad news. I think this is not only because of Iran. Let's not forget that most of these currencies were already weak before the 28th of February. And part of that is because central banks were actually front-loading cuts in 2025. So we were kind of feeling that they could do so because the Fed was coming, the Fed was going to cut, but the Fed didn't cut as much as expected. So in a way they felt they went too far. And then the Iran shock hit these currencies. I think it is extremely important that the central banks do their utmost, even if that hurts the economy a little bit, I get it, but they need to show their intention, their intent to keep those currencies as strong as possible, given that indeed to avoid that financial distress or crisis that you were referring to.
Professor Dar, help us understand what's going on in India with the rupee there. Is the weakness because India imports 90% of its crude oil? Is it because culturally Indians buy a lot of gold, which of course requires foreign currency to import and actually buy? Or is it a combination of other things?
No, it's a combination of several things. And part of the problem is that there have been structural weaknesses in the Indian economy. Of course, the government was talking about the current economy being one of the fastest growing in the world. But there have been doubts expressed by a whole lot of analysts that these numbers are not really real. And last year, after the Article 4 consultations with the IMF in fact flagged their concerns about the growth numbers, the way the GDP was being estimated in India. So there's a structural weaknesses which the economy has been suffering from post-COVID, and that only got heightened as this particular crisis hit us. And I think I entirely agree with Alicia that the central bank has to do its utmost to keep the currency strong. So already India is facing the largest merchandise trade deficit, and this could completely jeopardize current account if rupee slide is not controlled. So even at the expense of lowering its reserve to an extent, we have to do this.
Bima, can we talk about the rupiah? Because you can see that, look, things started to get worse for the rupiah when the Iran war started. But even if you look at the longer view, the currency was weakening for a long time now. So why is there so much weakness there?
I think there is a problem of growing fiscal deficit because of the energy subsidies increased dramatically. So before we already net importer of the oil, so we depend a lot on the foreign oil reserves. But when there's a Iran war, I think the deficit in the oil and gas not only suffers rupiah, but also it affected the budget deficit. And the Indonesia government policy domestically with the one getaway of the export of commodity, capital control by the central bank to limit up to $25,000 to the exchange. So I think those kind of Indonesia internal policy make the rupiah weakening a lot. So we think that there is less confidence from the market, from the investor, and then a lot of the uncertainty in terms of the government's policy, export policy, but also lack of the stimulus package for domestic demand under this time of the inflations began to increase in the food, but also in the logistic costs.
Alicia, this conversation can get pretty complicated. Obviously, there is a lot that impacts currency values, imports, exports, bond yields, but I wonder if it's not just a lot simpler than that. Does it not come down at the end of the day to supply and demand? I mean, if governments were to stop taking debt, stop printing money to inflate their way out of that debt, would that not solve the problem?
Unfortunately, confirms that things are more complicated than that. Actually, if you look at these countries that we're referring to, one could argue they have current account deficits. It's just logical. They as you said, they've gone too far. Maybe fiscally, maybe in terms of current account. But let's not forget that we have currencies out there. The Korean won with a massive current account surplus that is weakest ever. Yeah, so something is happening with these Asian currencies that is pretty interesting, because it's not only the usual suspects. You have here the usual suspects, the tapering currencies. But no, it's even those with current account surpluses that have very good currencies at the moment. And let me add one reason for it. The US stock market. The US is sucking in so many savings from Asia. So say you were a Japanese investor, maybe you were interested in the Indian stock market in 2024, it was actually booming. But nowadays, because of what's happening in the US, a lot of those investors, Korean, Japanese, you name it, are actually going to the US. So that's also one reason, which is independent from these countries, if you see. So I'm not saying there's nothing to be blamed about, but there is more than that. It's the US sucking the savings of the world, which is also weakening these currencies.
Yeah, and of course, the US stock market doing very well despite war, despite many problems that the world is facing right now, possibly inexplicably, some people may say. I just want to take a closer look at what measures two of Asia's largest emerging economies are taking. So we'll start with India, which is betting big on its own people to reduce demand for dollars. So Prime Minister Narendra Modi has appealed for voluntary austerity in a bid to stop money flowing out of the country. He's called on Indians to use less fuel, stop buying gold, and avoid traveling abroad. It's also hiked duties on gold and silver to 15%. India spent more than $72 billion importing gold this past year alone. The government has increased fuel prices several times after keeping them low for the first 2 months of this crisis. India imports nearly 90% of its oil and around half its natural gas, so it is among the countries that are really feeling the pressure here. So this was Prime Minister Narendra Modi's appeal to his fellow citizens. Listen.
There is a need for all of us to come together and fulfill our responsibility to reduce the burden on the country's resources. You know that India spends billions of rupees in foreign exchange to import many products. At the same time, the prices of imported goods are soaring and global supply chains have also been severely disrupted.
So, Professor Dar, the Prime Minister there is saying spend more money in India, buy less things that are imported. Is this sort of voluntary austerity, these voluntary measures, likely to actually work?
I don't think it's going to work. I think the gold is not just being used for social purposes in wedding economy. Gold has also become a safe haven for investors. And the stock market has been collapsing for several months now. Gold is being the safe haven for this. So this is not going to happen. It's impossible to expect Indians to stop or reduce consumption of edible oil. Because if you reduce consumption of edible oil, then you of course will reduce your consumption of food. It's just not possible. And Indians have got addicted to traveling abroad. Come these summer months, they have to travel abroad and start to benefit from, the economic expansion. Now just looks for destination abroad. It doesn't go for holidays within the country. So all that the government, the prime minister listed in terms of austerity and reducing foreign currency spending, that is not going to work. Even Make in India, that story hasn't actually worked very well, because we started this Make in India thing, and the self-reliant this slogan which was given in 2020. That hasn't really worked as per plan. We still import a lot of electronic products and components. The mobile phone manufacturers in India basically assemble the mobile phones after importing parts and components. So really this Make in India story is not going very far. So I don't think that what the Prime Minister has urged to do is really going to work.
Yeah.
In fact, I was very symbolic that it's going to give wrong signals to investors.
Sure. Alicia, I wonder, is there a sweet spot here for India? Because obviously a weaker currency makes its exports more attractive, but you don't want to be so weak that you can't afford to buy imports either. Is there kind of a sweet spot that maybe India is aiming for?
I'm afraid that India went beyond the sweet spot. The currency is too weak. And when you have a current account deficit, not because you have a weak currency, you're going to export. You need to have the industrial capacity. India's industrial production is around 18% of GDP. It's very low. So the currency is not going to push those exports that you need to balance the current account deficit. So no, a weak currency for India. The only positive, we need to find a positive, is that it could attract foreign direct investment. We had some good news on that front, but people need to believe that the currency is going to be stronger, so that they invest at the weakest point. So the government needs to give a signal. And the only signal, frankly, unfortunately, is you need to cut costs. You just need to show your intent. Again, it's not enough to expect people to follow these policies of, spell the dollar. You need to show that you really do. And that the easiest way is to cut rates, which will hurt the economy, but I think it's better than having a very weak currency.
I want to ask you guys about Indonesia. Indonesia is taking a different approach to India. It is increasing state control over exports, which has been criticized as a sharp surge in resource nationalism. So the government accuses companies of avoiding taxes by selling underpriced commodities to affiliates abroad who then resell globally at a markup. A state-run agency has been set up that will be the sole buyer of Indonesian commodities. That way the state gets to export them and reap profits. It will initially cover coal, palm oil, and certain nickel products, all of which Indonesia is the world's largest exporter of. All foreign currency that comes in from this will be deposited in state-owned banks, which is an effort to prop up the value of the rupiah. So Bima, what do you think of this? Is this likely to work? Has it shown signs of working already?
No, actually they try to postpone, and then one getaway of the export or resource nationalisms that been going in the Indonesia. I think there is a lot of criticisms and a lot of new input, especially from the investors, but also from the export-led commodity, because we think that if this is the moment that the commodity like coal, palm oil, nickels products should be increased in terms of the price, but the government thinks that it is better to fight the underprice and also controlling all the foreign reserves in terms of the export of Indonesia commodity. So instead of giving like a stimulus package or increasing like ministerial levels monitorings of all the commodities, the Indonesian government thinks that it is better to have like a state control. I think that's weakening more rupiah pressures, but also the capital outflow from the stock market, especially the stocks related to the commodity base. So I will say that there is no windfall this time for the major Indonesia commodity. Instead, I think country like Malaysia for the palm oil and the other countries also enjoying more kind of a windfall from the high price because the Indonesian government thinks that instead of going for exporting more palm oil, Indonesia want to tackle the deficit of the oil and gas by switching to national biofuel, which is also kind of problematic at the moment. So the government that uses state control, I think the problem is on the government policy itself. But right now, everyone is blaming the central bank. But actually, the central bank did all the monetary policy, but the problem is on the fiscal side and also on the export state control mechanism.
Indonesian President Prabowo Subianto spoke about the rupiah's weakness at two events during a visit to East Java province in May, where he really downplayed the impact on villagers that has sparked a backlash on social media. So he told them this, quote, however many thousands of rupiah the exchange rate to the dollar is, you folks in villages do not use the dollar anyway. He later added, quote, believe that our economy is strong, our fundamentals are strong. Whatever people say, Indonesia is strong. Alicia, obviously Indonesians do not use the dollar, but clearly if you have a weak currency, your buying power abroad is less for things that you import. Are Indonesians right to be offended by the president maybe trying to pull the wool over people's eyes there?
Well, I'm not Indonesian and I'm nobody to judge, if you see what I mean. But let's be frank. Weak currency, if you need to import, is of course hurting the purchasing power of not only Indonesian, also Japanese at the current juncture. Meaning, this is not about Indonesia. This is the law of gravity, you know. But I quite agree with the fact that this is not only. The central bank, in the case of Indonesia, I would argue the central bank cannot solve this problem. In the case of India, because the fiscal deficit has been shrinking, it's big, but shrinking, I would argue that the central bank has more room and, you know, it's been intervening. I don't know. I would say for Indonesia, I quite agree. What I would do is exactly the opposite on the export control part. I would open Indonesia to foreign direct investment. I would actually try to get as much FDI as possible, rather than control the exports of what Indonesia really has to offer today, which is all of these commodities. So, to me, that policy is not helping. I very much agree.
I want to go back in time for a second to 1991, because India, at least, has been here before. So I want to show you a graphic of the USD to Indian rupee conversion rate. So if you just looked at the left side of this chart, that first spike there, that was 1991. And basically, the Gulf War caused the price of oil to surge. Also, the collapse of the Soviet Union around the same time caused exports to really slump. And there really was no emergency brake here because India only had enough foreign reserves to cover about 3 weeks worth of imports. Now it has about 11 months worth of imports. But I wonder, Bima, are you concerned that there are countries in Asia that don't have that much of a runway in terms of their foreign currency reserves to back their own currency or to buy up their own currency to prop up their values?
Yeah, of course. I think many of the emerging countries even thought we have like 5% more GDP growth. But the big question is how much the international debt and short-term debt payment. Because in the Indonesia context, for instance, that this year and next year there will be like a high debt maturity for Indonesian governments, but also on the state-owned enterprise and private sectors. So I think the problems right now is how much money that we need, either coming from tax, either coming from export activities that can help stabilize the rupiah, stabilize the currency, local currency. I think that's kind of a big challenge. And then when we compare with 1998, ASEAN financial crisis, I think Indonesia, yes, grows stronger in terms of the currency reserve by the central bank. But when there is a sudden shock in the bond market, and then many of the rating agency right now is trying to analyze how the fiscal space can save if there is like a sudden shock, but also the monetary space that can be used in terms of the emergency. So this is like a crucial moment, but for the Indonesian context, instead of giving more room for private sectors to gather all of the export, gather all of the new investment, they try to block all the things that can create more fresh money from abroad. So I think the capital control, it is similar tactics that being done during the Asian financial crisis, but we are more integrated on the global financial system. That make it very, very difficult if we use capital control again during this time. I think it can be a backlash for many of the emerging economies in Southeast Asia, especially Indonesia.
Alicia, do you think that some of this could be solved by some of these Asian economies requiring exports to be purchases of their exports to be settled in their own currencies rather than US dollars? I mean, wouldn't that have the effect of increasing demand for their own currencies rather than sort of inadvertently propping up the value of the dollar?
Yeah, it's a good suggestion, but you cannot do that in a stress situation because the reading will be negative. Of course, there is something already happening, which is the RMB as a settlement currency for trade. The RMB already surpassed the euro as the second most traded currency for trade settlements. So that's a possibility. Many of the central banks have swap lines with the PBOC, but the trick, nothing is for free. There's no free lunch here. The trick is then you get a non-convertible currency, and what you can purchase comes from that very same country. So, the dependence on China increases, and it's certainly not the same to have